Our panel discussion, the writing of history without bias. The panelists are Dr. Hamida Khoro, Dr. Jean-Luc Racine, Dr. M.R. Kazmi, and Dr. Parvez Hoodboy. The moderator is Alex von Tonzelman. And actually, I'll just hand over to the moderator, Alex. But before we start, I would like to thank the French Consul General, Mr. Christian Ramage, who's with us here today, and the French Embassy for supporting us in this panel by sponsoring the visit to Pakistan of Dr. Jean-Luc Racine, who has come from Paris, and also of Dr. Michel Boivin, who will be speaking in a session on Sufism today. So I just want to acknowledge the support of the French Consulate and the French Embassy. Thank you.
Right, everyone turn their microphones on. Welcome to the Writing of History Without Bias session at the Karachi Literary Festival. Thank you very much for having us here. Thank you to Amina Saeed for organizing it and for all of you for coming. I think we're starting more on time than even I was expecting. So hopefully we will kind of have a lively session today. I'm hoping to have quite a back and forth debate. So I'm going to be jumping in and then we're going to talk for a bit and then we'll have questions at a certain point, or my inaudible. Always good to start off being inaudible. The Writing of History Without Bias, I mean, this is a question that when I saw on the sheet that this was going to be our subject, the first thing you study if you go into a history degree at university is that the first assumption that is given to you is that actually all history has bias of some sort. To have it without bias is impossible. Even if you have a list of facts and dates unadorned, nonetheless the selection of those facts and dates is a form of bias in itself. Napoleon famously said, "What is history but a fable agreed on?" That actually, in a sense, history becomes a kind of coalescing story from lots of different sources. And here in the subcontinent, there's been kind of a particular interest in history without bias because so much of the history that's come out about events like partition has been very much slanted one way or another. There are strong political interests around a lot of history that also kind of pull it one way or the other. Of course, not having bias or being dispassionate, if you like, if we want to use a kind of more neutral term, is not the same thing as not having opinions, and I'm hoping we're going to have some opinions today on this panel. So without further ado, I want to start with Jean-Luc Racine and ask, what do we mean by unbiased history?
Well, in fact, you said it. No one knows is there such a thing. And of course, it's not something specific to the subcontinent. It's something which is, the question is valid absolutely everywhere. It's linked to what's happened also everywhere, which is the construction of national mythologies, of what we may call the grand narratives of each nation. And if I'm myself something of an expert on South Asia, I may introduce perhaps some remarks coming from my European experience, but not as an expert on Europe, simply as a European, and particularly as a French. And of course, working now for quite a number of years on Pakistan-Indian relation, it seems quite easy to shift from that to the Franco-German relationship. The parallel might, of course, be valid, but only up to a point, precisely because every country, or every set of countries, have their own specific histories, their own background, their own mythologies, if I may say so. And it's not quite sure that what we may learn about the process of use and misuse of histories that have been deciphered as far as European history is concerned is easy to translate from one continent to another one. But nevertheless, it's quite clear that what we may think about what has been the established official histories for decades during a time of repeated wars, and of course everyone knows that the kind of wars which were fought between the French and the German have nothing common with what have been the war between India and Pakistan. The war between India and Pakistan has basically been short. The last two wars between France and Germany have transformed themselves in global war in a way. Nevertheless, what's really fascinating is how after the Second World War, statesmen decided that enough was enough, and that it was time to rethink relationship between two countries. And of course, for rethinking relationship between two countries, you have to rethink the established histories of the two countries. Nevertheless, it's a process which is taking quite a lot of time, you know. Those who planned the kind of reconciliation between the French and the German started their work as early as 1950. But the first common historical textbook, co-published by a French and German publisher, co-authors by French and German historians, has been published only in 2006. So it took almost one generation for historians being able to work together. And here again, we come back, of course, to something which is extremely important, something which has been underlined here in Pakistan almost 20 years ago by K.K. Aziz in his book, The Murder of History, about the absolute importance of what is said and not said in the textbooks. And that's why, in fact, the first real markstone in the history of the bilateral rethinking about history between the two countries has been textbook. Later on, quite a couple of years ago, there was also, and I'll stop with that, a very interesting book co-written by a French and a German historian on the First World War. And here it's very there is a point which has to be underlined. In a way, it was easier to rethink the Second World War because the Second World War was basically a fight between fascism and the rest, while the First World War, 1914, 1918, which has been a real butchery, was a war against nationalism. And it's much more difficult to rethink national history and their drift than to rethink the big fight of the 20th century between the fascists and the Democrats. I'll stop at that because there is so much to say.
There is. This subject is quite massive, actually. Pervez Hoodbhoy, how close are we to a joint India-Pakistan history?
Well, I thought I might make some comments about interpreting history through the filter of the mind. The mind is a cognitive system. And those who study cognitive processes, they tell us that there is a complex system of filters that operate, that exist in the mind. Actually, this is very necessary because otherwise, whatever information we would get would be a complete mess. It'll be just a jumble of facts which then could not be interpreted usefully. So we have to have something like an operating system, something like, let's say, Windows or Mac or Linux or whatever, that organizes the mind so that it can usefully categorize facts and put them into appropriate places. Sometimes what happens is that this operating system can become deformed or malformed, and then the categorization of facts then leads to amazing nonsense in the interpretation of history. To be fair to everyone, let me give a number of examples. The Israelis believe that they came to a land. The slogan of the Israelis was, as they took over Palestine, that this was land for people without a land, as if no one else lived over there. To give another example, in spite of the fact that Al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein were at war with each other, and Saddam Hussein had tried to kick out Al-Qaeda from there. Nevertheless, 50% of Americans believed that, in fact, Saddam Hussein was friendly with Al-Qaeda, and therefore Iraq had to be attacked because of that. Well, more close to our neighborhood, let's look at the issue of Babri Mosque. There are even Hindus with PhDs who believe that Lord Ram was born at the place of Babri Masjid, and so therefore Babri Masjid had to be demolished. Well, coming to Pakistan, the malformation or the deformation is even greater. We can look back into our history and see example after example where objective truth and the perception of truth are miles apart. Let's take the issue of the separation of East Pakistan in 1971. If you were to ask the man on the street today, why is it that East Pakistan separated? The most probable reply that you will get is because it was a Hindu conspiracy, because there were Hindu teachers who poisoned the minds of young Muslim children in East Pakistani schools, that there was a conspiracy which was hatched in India, that Mujibur Rahman was an Indian agent, and so forth. They will perhaps not even listen to you when you say that, in fact, the Bengalis are an independent people who, even today, do not want to join up with West Pakistan. They believe that they were mistreated, that they were exploited by the West, and that they had genuine grievances. That sort of perception, that sort of understanding is absent among not just our school children today, but among even senior educated people.
If I can move
Whatever.
on to, sorry, to take the question to Professor Kazmi, I'd like to ask, so conspiracy theory in history, it's something that's a big feature of history in much of the world. Do conspiracies rush in where history is biased and inadequate?
Well, let me start with a few observations of Professor Racine. You see, he mentioned Peter Gale's Napoleon For and Against, and the debate about the origin of the First World War began first in the winning power in Britain itself. You know that there's a debate between Trevor Roper and A.J.P. Taylor about the origins, in which Taylor tried to depersonalize the whole causes of this Second World War. And of course, we need to rethink our history, and as he said, Parvez Hudbhoy here, that there are distortions. I've been teaching history for more than 30 years, and let me tell you one thing, that the official textbooks which were written during the Zia era, which I would really call the Ronald Reagan Zia era, because what we faced were textbooks given to secondary school students or college students. But the books Kathy Gannon has mentioned, K for Kalashnikov, J for Jihad, what I want to say is that we are not naturally terrorists. We have a floating population